Mission Log Supplemental Number 22, the one with Wil Wheaton.
All right, welcome, friends, to another supplemental episode of Mission Log, a Roddenberry Star Trek podcast. I'm John Champion.
And I'm Ken Ray.
And today we are thrilled to have a very special guest with us. It's a very special episode of Mission Log, a Roddenberry Star Trek podcast, Ken, because we have the two-dub. We got Wil Wheaton.
Are we going to learn something today because it's a very special episode?
You tell me, man. I don't know. We might. There might be tears. There might be anger. There might be reconciliation. There might be hugging, if we could do that.
Just as long as it ends with music that goes, da-da-da. That's what we need.
I was going to say, if you could just stop me in the middle and ask me about, I don't know, my problems with drugs or my food issues or, something that we could just take 2 minutes and really just stop the entire interview and and do that.
I'm glad that we're on the same page.
Yeah. Fortunately, we have no structure. Yeah.
As long as I have known that you were out there to interview, there is a question that I've just been dying to ask you.
Uh-huh.
What was it like working with Tina Yothers?
It was actually really great. That was so much fun. I was a huge fan of Family Ties, and I loved the experience of being on that set and seeing the Keaton house that I had imagined as like this three-dimensional home in my mind. Right. The sort of sound stage and set that I was really used to spending a whole lot of my time on because, that's what I did as an actor. Right. And she was great. We were very close in age. I mean, I think we may even be the exact same age or separated by, less than a year in a way that it just didn't really matter. And we immediately got on so well. And I had known her brother just because we were both like commercial actors at the same time. So I would see her brother on commercial auditions all the time, but I never really saw, I'd never really seen her because she was working full time on Family Ties. So that was great. I mean, it was sort of imagine like, I am of a generation where the Keatons were kind of like, they were like a TV family that lived kind of in this box in my house. So when I got to go and work on that set and be part of their reality, it was really cool. I imagine that I felt the way a lot of people felt when over the years on Star Trek, people would come on and after 2 or 3 days of production, they would kind of out themselves as giant Star Trek fans and tell us how excited they were to be on the Enterprise. And I had the same feeling when I was on that in the Keaton house.
Well, cool. Thanks for coming on, Will.
No, here's the thing. I was actually kidding when I asked that question, but you've opened up this whole different sort of thing for me. Was there any part of you then that didn't actually want to do that? Because you're right. It exists as like this home where you go. Like when you got to be on the Enterprise 1701D, nobody had been on it before. So there's no like, oh, well, this is going to ruin the illusion for me or something like that. I mean, was there any part of you that thought, I don't want to see behind the scenes, because behind the scenes is how you get to the living room and then you go upstairs and they're at the bedrooms, as opposed to you go up the stairs and you run into a gaffer.
I always thought that it was so cool that we created this reality, like together by like everyone just agreeing, this is how we're going to play make-believe today. I always thought that was really cool. And I never had any reservations about it. I never felt like I was like I was missing out on anything by actually getting to see it. In fact, when I was working on Star Trek, I walked into the bridge for rehearsals when they weren't the set wasn't done yet. The set was, like the shape of things was there, but there was exposed wood all over the place, and like little pieces of lights were sort of plugged in some places, and I could see it like beginning to take shape. It's interesting, I haven't thought about that in nearly 30 years, but I remember being on that set. lit only by a bare work bulb, and rehearsing the first time Wesley walks onto the bridge, and then contrast that with going into stage 9 and walking into the corridors and the transporter room and the engine room and all of those sets. A couple of years before I worked on Next Generation, I worked on Saint Elsewhere. And the set for Saint Elsewhere was very immersive. They had all the corridors for the hospital, and they had all the examination rooms, and all of the sets had ceilings. When I worked in a lot of things as a smaller kid, there were never ceilings on the sets because you just never photographed up that way, right? Mm-hmm. But on St. Elsewhere, they did those walk and talk shots down the corridors. So they had what I found out later was just muslin pulled across frames and set on top of the set. So it looked like a 3-dimensional immersive set. And one of the things that I thought was so insanely cool when I walked onto stage 9, and stage 9 was almost finished because those corridors had been rebuilt from the original series movies. And when I walked on there and saw that, like, I could walk into these corridors in the spaceship, and I could get to a point where I could turn in a complete circle and I could only see the walls of the spaceship. Like, I had such a great imagination that was as good for me as being on the actual Enterprise as if it were a real thing.
How cool. Very cool. Well, I want to go backwards a little bit before we get deeply into Next Gen, because something that we've talked about before is your fandom as a kid, just before Star Trek The Next Generation was a gleam in anyone's eye. Mm-hmm. You as a kid, as a fan of Star Trek and Star Wars, I know, but the original series was something that really brought you in and really held you for a long time. I wonder if you can talk to us a little bit about when you were first aware of that show and what your interest was in that show.
I don't have that clear memory of the first time I saw Star Trek. It's not like the first time I went to see Star Wars, which isn't even as clear as the memory of the first time I went to see Raiders of the Lost Ark, which is really clear for me because I saw it at the Egyptian Theater in Hollywood. And when you walked out of the Egyptian Theater and you were 8 years old, you could imagine, based on the architecture of that place, that you were now Indiana Jones in Raiders of the Lost Ark, and you and your friend could run around and play there until one of the theater workers came in and told you that you couldn't climb on that thing. But I Star Trek, kind of like the Twilight Zone and the Outer Limits, and then other things like Chips and Emergency and Fantasy Island and Love Boat, is part of the background of my childhood. And what I remember clearly about Star Trek is that it was on in the afternoons, like after those cartoons that you would see when you got home from school were over. Then it would be like Star Trek and then something that I didn't care about, like Adam 12 or Dragnet or something like that. And I watched, well, my dogs are very excited. Yeah, Seamus, I know, buddy. The mailman's not going to come inside the house. The mailman never comes inside the house, buddy.
These are the conversations that I have with Duncan every day.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
Got it, buddy. Thank you. Okay. All right, see you later. So, I was watching the original Star Trek on like a 13-inch black and white television because that's what we had. And much like when I watched the original Doctor Who, the television was just getting things via an antenna, and it was kind of staticky and a little, there weren't any colors, so it looked a little weird. It made the special effects look completely real to me, and it made the aliens look completely real to me. And I just loved it. When I was a little boy, I didn't really understand kind of the like social aspects of Star Trek. I didn't understand how it was shaping my ethics and it was shaping my morality, because it wasn't like overbearing about that. It was just part of the fabric of the show. But I loved the adventure of it, and I loved the camaraderie among the crew, and I loved how each person was important and each person was good at a thing, and if you took them and isolated them, they were good at that thing. But if you put them all together and they worked as a team, like they could do anything. And I loved that. And I thought it was really cool. And when all the other kids wanted to play like Star Wars at recess, or wanted to, play like Cops and Robbers or whatever, I really wanted to make the Jungle Gyms the Enterprise.
Well, so let's talk about that a little bit, what you just said about kind of as a kid maybe missing the moral and social aspects of the show. At one time it was just an adventure show in space, and you like these characters and you like how they interact. But then over time, so you continue to watch the show, and then you're a part of the show in a different iteration. And a couple of years ago, in an interview that I shot, you said something that really stuck with me. You said, Star Trek made me a secular humanist.
Yeah.
And I was curious when you came to that realization, like when you thought that the show had helped shape your views, or when you thought that maybe, okay, my views now dovetail with this thing that is a piece of pop culture.
I think it's more that that it dovetailed with what Star Trek was doing. I wasn't like, there wasn't a moment where I was like, oh man, Star Trek says that thing, so that's my thing.
Right.
But this is what I clearly remember. I was in a parochial school, and it was the early 80s. It was Reagan's America. It was ultra right wing, super judgy, really self-righteous, and unbelievably authoritarian, this school. And my favorite family member was my uncle. And my uncle was a Buddhist. And we were having a conversation one day in class. The teacher was sort of like, leading a conversation in class about, just like about things. I don't remember what it was. And in the course of this conversation, she was going on and on about how, only people who believe what we believe are going to heaven. Everyone else is going to hell. It was like there was a lot of that in this school. I was familiar with the concepts of heaven and hell, not a big fan. I remember saying to her, well, so my uncle is a good person. He's kind. He's friendly. He's funny. He's loving. He follows all these rules you tell us to follow. But he's a Buddhist, so obviously he's going to heaven too, right? And she was like, oh no, he's going to hell. And I could not square in my little 8-year-old head how a person who had never hurt anyone, who had never done anything bad, who was really wonderful, could be damned to the same sort of like eternal punishment as like a horrible criminal or a terrible, terrible, terrible person. And right around that time, I thought, a lot of this stuff doesn't make sense. I'm starting to think like these things kind of contradict each other. And as I started to ask questions about that stuff, because I was genuinely confused and interested, I started to get in trouble for it. And I started getting sent to have like, counseling with the pastor, or getting like had to have long talks with the principal, and I was like missing out on like recess and stuff like that, all because I was basically committing thought crime. Mm-hmm. And it was around that time that I concluded that religion was that there was no way that all these different people could all say we're the only ones that are right, everybody else is wrong. Like that just didn't stand up to math. And I guess that I took that belief system, and as I watched Star Trek more and more as I got older, and as I became a member of Next Generation, and as I grew to know Gene, and as I got deeper into science fiction, I realized that a lot of the stuff that I liked about the religion, about like basically not being a dick and being kind and doing good things and like respecting people and being charitable and being gracious and all that, like you could take out all the damnation stuff and then you would get secular humanism. And I felt this tremendous sense of relief because I had found a thing that allowed me to like identify myself without having to identify myself as a member of a religion. And I had grown up believing that if you didn't have a religion, and specifically if you didn't have this religion, that you were somehow inherently a bad person. And it took me a long time to kind of deprogram myself from that belief system, because, you know, when you're indoctrinated as a child and it shapes your reality, to sort of ultimately reject that and draw additional conclusions, that's really hard to do. But I guess in a not insignificant way, I had the stories that Star Trek told kind of like supporting this morality that I was defining and discovering for myself.
Are you a fan of the animated series, or have you watched the animated series?
I love the animated series.
Right.
All right, because like right in the middle of that, I'm thinking if he hasn't seen the Magics of Magus 2,
Right.
with the devil in the middle of the universe, but not the devil in that whole thing.
Yeah.
That's like exactly what you were just talking about. It seems like.
You know, there's stuff in the animated series that's a little silly, and there's stuff in the animated series that's, I mean, look, it's an animated series, right? But it's so good at being what it wanted to be. And the animation is of a time, but it has that look, you know, that like immediately takes me back to my childhood. And I think they told some really great stories. And I think they maybe leaned a little too heavily on, we're animated, so we can go beyond the constraints of you know, live action television.
Right.
But I mean, it's right there, right? I mean, it kind of like that. The animated series came along at a time in my life as like Land of the Lost and the original Battlestar Galactica, and you know, like really kind of like it talks about heavy stuff without being heavy-handed. I mean, that's what science fiction is, right?
Right.
Science fiction, when it is at its absolute best, gives us an opportunity to think about and confront complex moral and ethical issues without being heavy-handed about it. And if you don't want to confront those issues, you just ignore them and enjoy the space opera.
That was another thing that was fantastic about, I mean, so when we were watching the animated series for this show last year, the thing that I kept thinking about is, okay, these are some really complex issues. These are some really heavy thoughts, and they're laying them down for like, you know, 7 to 10-year-olds because mom and dad are still asleep.
Yeah.
Kids are getting up on Saturday morning and turning on Star Trek, and you know, mom and dad think that, you know, it's like they're watching Scooby-Doo, they're watching whatever that thing, Grape Ape, maybe. Oh yeah, they're watching Star Trek. That's fine. And the thing is, Grape Ape is just walking around being dumb, but Star Trek's, you know, whether the kids knew it at the time or not, had to be blowing their minds.
Yeah, I think that there are certain things that are made for kids, but they're like they're so like, I wouldn't say that they're subversive, but they're sneaky in how they let kids, like they teach kids things without making them feel like they're in school. At the moment, I have the extraordinary privilege to be a reoccurring villain on a series called Miles from Tomorrowland. that is that's a new Disney show, and every episode has something really cool about science and space exploration in it, and it actually figures prominently into the plot, but not in an overt way. It's kind of the way that like all of us who grew up in Generation X know the preamble to the Constitution and know the way a bill becomes a law because of Schoolhouse Rock. Like, we didn't realize that we were learning those things. They were just there for us.
So what are some of the things in Star Trek, whether it's the original or the animated? Ken, I'm glad you brought up the magics of Megas 2, because you got to tell kids on a Saturday morning, hey, there's no devil.
Well, no, there is a devil, but he's not the devil.
Yeah, he's a guy with who's a little misunderstood. You know,
that was the thing that was so not to bore listeners, but that was the thing that was so mind blowing about it. Was, I mean, if you're saying everything you know about the devil might be wrong, then you're saying, oh, and by the way, that means everything you know about God might be wrong too, and that means that everything you know about everything might be wrong. So go have your cereal and talk to your folks about it later.
Exactly. So, Will, what are maybe some of the plot lines or stories or moments, whether it's the original series or Next Gen or whatever, that kind of stand out to you as philosophically important? Those touchstones that you really identify with and go, yeah, that's what this is all about.
I'm going to just pick one, because we could sit here for hours while I go through almost every episode and pull out something for you. But I'm just going to pick out one because it is absolutely the most significant and longest lasting and most like impactful for me. When I was around 17, 18 years old, it was right around the time that I left Next Generation. I was really unhappy with myself. I didn't feel comfortable in the entertainment industry. I was struggling to reconcile how much I loved the cast of Next Generation, but how much I resented the way Rick Berman treated me. And I was like, there were times where I was just like, I didn't realize at the time that I was just leveling as a human. And part of leveling as a human is making mistakes and doing things that you regret. And I was really hard on myself. And I was really, really struggling to sort of like atone for things that I felt I had done that were shitty to people. And ultimately this led me to completely walk away from the entertainment industry and go work in a real job and go kind of like experience the real world for a while I went on this kind of like journey to figure out who I was. And I realized that a lot of normal people do this when they go to college, but I didn't have a normal upbringing, and I didn't have that experience. As I grew older and I worked through a lot of that stuff, I had this moment in my life where I had to go see my sister, and I felt like I had to apologize for not being a better big brother. And I felt like I needed to atone for like kind of being overwhelmed by being a famous kid and having this real weird relationship with my parents that never felt like I was family, that always felt like I was a business partner. And how like that had affected everything that I had to do. And I have depression, and around this time, my depression was real bad, and I was feeling really bad, and I was really full of regret, and to the point where I was just like, I would just get despondent and just feel like I've made some really bad choices, and I've really hurt some people who didn't deserve it, and I need to like, I need to not do that. I need to like correct for that. And around this time, so I guess I'm in like my early 20s, my mid 20s maybe. I rewatched the episode Tapestry from Next Generation, And I imagine that people who are listening to this have probably realized this is all a preamble to Tapestry. But this is significant for me because I couldn't watch Star Trek. As much as I loved Star Trek, I couldn't watch it. It was super painful for me. I felt like Star Trek was my family. The cast was my family. And I felt like in some ways, largely as a way of reacting to the way Rick Berman treated me, I felt like I had turned my back on my family and I had walked away from my family, and I was so ashamed, and I felt like I didn't deserve to be there. I didn't deserve to be close to them. Like I had this chance to be part of this thing and I had squandered it, and now I had to deal with the consequences. And I also felt that way about other relationships in my life. And I just felt this deep sense of shame and regret. And I watched Tapestry I don't even remember why I did it. I think I must have been flipping through TV channels and come across, BBC America and seen that episode. And I stopped and watched it. And I had not watched Star Trek in a really long time because it was really, really hard. If I saw Wesley episodes, all I could do was criticize myself. If I saw older Wesley episodes, all I could do was feel sad and regretful about maybe leaving Next Generation at a time when it was kind of getting to be as good as it was. But I watched it anyway. And at the end of that episode, when Picard talks about plucking on the threads of the tapestry of his life and how pulling one unraveled the whole thing, I had this profound epiphany that I could take all of these experiences that I regret, and I could take all of these choices I had made that I was ashamed of, and I could learn from them. And I could commit myself to not repeating those mistakes. And I could use them to learn and to grow. And I could just own those things and let them be part of me. And accept that there was a time where I was a loud-mouthed young man who, had a lot of opinions and not a lot of wisdom, who eventually grew into someone who's raised two amazing kids and done a lot of good things with his life. And once I was able to do that, I feel like I became a fully functioning human being. And it wasn't until I was in my late 20s that happened. And it was a long process, it took years for that to finally all take hold. But it was sitting down and watching that episode and identifying with Picard and seeing the Picard that could have been if he had made those changes to his life, that allowed me to reflect on that in myself in a way that wasn't possible if someone had said to me, you're a sum of your experiences and you have to accept that sometimes you make bad choices. And guess what? Everybody does that. The difference between a piece of crap and a person is that a good person atones for it and learns from it and doesn't repeat that stuff. And a piece of crap never takes responsibility for those things. Star Trek let me do that in a way that just having a conversation with anyone never would have. And it actually made it okay for me to go watch Patrick do a Christmas story, a Christmas Carol. And then afterward, he invited me backstage. And it allowed me to, one, accept the invitation, which I would not have accepted before because I would have felt humiliated and ashamed, but also to say to him, I just wanted to tell you that I know that there were times on the set that I wasn't there like I should have been, and I really, really regret it. And he said, you were a kid and you were doing your best, and I always treated you like an actor, and I knew what you were going through. We all knew what you were going through. And Marina said, we all saw the way the producers treated you. And no one ever had a bad thought about the choices that you made. And it allowed me to heal within myself relationships that were and are really important to me. and allowed me to realize that like I had spent a long time feeling like I couldn't have these relationships that actually were there for me all along, had I just been willing to like allow myself to embrace them.
Is there a way to do? Forgive me, because I want to actually take us to the production of Next Gen, but there's sort of a broader question at the same time. I want to talk about you specifically on Next Gen, but is there a way to do child acting and not? I mean, you're being thrown into something, and you already had experience going on the Next Gen, but it's a different thing. You hadn't done a series before, right? You had guested on a series, but you hadn't done a recurring series, had you?
That's correct.
So you're going to carry a lot more weight as a recurring character on a series, it seems to me, than you would as just like the episode of Family Ties that we talked about. Am I right in thinking that you and LeVar Burton had the biggest success as far as actors go going into TNG? Not in terms of experience necessarily, because certainly Patrick Stewart had been acting for a while, but you had done Stand By Me, LeVar Burton had done Roots. In terms of recognizability, and of course he was doing Reading Rainbow, I guess, as well.
Yeah.
Were you like the biggest? You were the biggest names associated with that show, weren't you? Or the biggest faces anyway.
Yeah, we were. And David Gerald tells this story, and I've actually seen the memo. David sent a memo to Bob Justman, and he said, look, I think this idea of having a kid on the show I think it's a bad idea, because kids in sci-fi always end up being this trope and not this character. And if you're going to do this, you need to get an actor who can handle it, who's going to be real, who can rise to the challenge of the role. And he said, I just saw this kid in this movie Stand By Me, and the teenage girls are, he's all over the teen magazine, so the teenage girls love him, and I think he's an actor who can handle the role. If you're going to do it, and I don't think you should, but if you're going to do it, I think this is someone you ought to look at. And that's how I got the audition.
Do you think there's something because the kinds of things that you're talking about, I mean, it's horrifying to think that everybody is standing there with this 15-year-old kid. This 15-year-old kid is going through major crap. And the problem is, I mean, whether you're talking about depression or not, 15-year-old kids go through major crap. But who knows how to talk to a 15-year-old kid about the major crap they're going to, except for maybe another 15-year-old kid. But then you're both just sitting there going, damn, this is effed up. Pardon me.
Yeah, I think that – so I had been raised as an actor. I've been raised in the entertainment industry. And whenever I was basically not allowed to be a child. Here's the thing that happens with kids. Some days you don't want to be on the set because you're a kid. You don't want to be there. You want to be playing video games. You want to be playing D&D. You want to be running around at the playground. You don't – I remember being on a show where we filmed in an arcade. We were in an arcade. There were hundreds of video games everywhere, and I was not allowed to play a single one. And just not allowed to be a kid. And being told, be professional. You have to, don't act your age. Mm-hmm. And that was the thing that I internalized. And it became such a huge part of how I'm supposed to behave. And I saw it around other kids too. Don't be difficult. The answer is always yes, sir, to whatever they want you to do. And, all those things, because parents are like cash and checks, and parents know that if this kid's a pain in the ass by the definition of the production, well, here's 30 other kids who aren't, and it's just sort of like it becomes like, this thing where you're not allowed to be a kid. And by the time I got onto Next Generation, I felt like, all right, I'm a professional. I know how to conduct myself as a professional. I know how to walk on the set, hit my mark, say my lines, know my lines, understand this scene, portray the character. I know how to do the acting thing. I can do all of that, but I don't know how to human. I don't know how to talk to the adults around me because they're adults and I'm a kid. And I tried so hard to relate to the adults that were around me. You know, I tried so hard to be like cool like LeVar and funny like Brent and a masterful actor like Patrick and just like so confident and like self-assured like Frakes. And, you know, I imprinted on each of them like a little bit of a different kind of piece of my personality. And each one of them was important to me in a different way. But the thing is, I could never talk to them in a meaningful way. I never felt like I could say, hey, I need advice about this. I need to learn how to talk to girls. I need to know how do I talk to an adult about those things? Because I felt like I had to be a professional. When I was with my friends off set, it was different. You know, I mean, I could be a kid. We were all lame kids, and we were all kind of trying to figure out what was going on in our lives. But on the set, I never really had that privilege. And it's actually a thing that I carry with me now as an adult. You know, when I work on a show and there's a kid on a show, I work real hard to talk with that kid and that kid's parents and help. Just like, it's almost like I'm going to give you the level walkthrough for this game because I've played it and I know where the traps and monsters are. And back then, nobody really had that. And certainly nobody on the set had that. There were, you know, for me being on the set, it was very much like everyone was basically a parent figure to me in one way or another. And they all kind of looked after me in their own way. And they all like gave me like ethics and morality in different ways, directly and indirectly, that really shaped the person that I am today.
Can I blow your mind a little bit? We haven't released this yet, and maybe I'll release it alongside this episode. But one of the things that we do in Mission Log is we have documents from the Roddenberry archive that we kind of pull and we'll post on the website. And there's one here that is a memo from Patrick Stewart to Gene Roddenberry. This was written early season 2-ish, because he makes mention of, here are all the things that Picard does that are kind of dull. Like, I've talked down Nagilum, and I've done this, and I've done that, but I want more. And here are the things that I could do that are more. But then he talks about relationships, and he talks about how the relationship between Picard and Number One maybe hasn't been fleshed out. And then what did we do with Beverly? Now she's gone, so we can't really explore that anymore. And then there's a couple of lines in here. He said, I have yet to play a scene with Will that was not a delight. Have I ever told you what a fan I am of that young man? I hope that I am not going to entirely lose him to Geordi, Riker, and Guinan. I thought that was so cool.
Oh, my God.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'll send you a copy of that.
Thank you.
That I thought that was...
I had no idea.
Yeah. It was a private letter between those two.
Oh, my God.
So there it is.
I can't remember which episode it was that we just watched, John, and that's a sort of a trademark of what I do. But there is actually a fascinating scene, and it would be around the time, I guess, of that memo. There's a fascinating scene. It's the one with, dude, you're going to have to help me out on all of this stuff. He comes in. This is something we do. I apologize, Will. He comes in and he wants to talk about, it's the one with the Yamato.
Contagion.
So he comes in and he's like, so tell me about this other race. And the interesting thing is you can see that there is a relationship being built there between Wesley and Picard. And so it's not surprising. It's actually really neat. It's actually neat to hear that was a plan for Patrick Stewart's as well.
Yeah.
You know, I think that one of the areas where the writers and producers really missed it with Wesley was not taking advantage of the reality of Wesley Crusher as an actual person, and looking at what I was going through as a person. I was an analog to Wesley on the set because I was a child who could conduct himself very well professionally around adults, but was really alone and really didn't have the level of camaraderie of like going out to eat after work or going to the house for a barbecue or hanging out, which is, it's nobody's fault. It's the reality. I'm 15. They're adults, right? And that created this angst in me that I wish had been explored within Wesley Crusher. We saw it a few times. We saw it. I just recently watched Pen Pals by accident. I was at home, and I just did this like a week or so ago, 2 weeks ago. I was sitting at home, and I saw that Star Trek was on, and I thought, I'm going to watch Next Generation and see if I remember anything from it. And this episode starts up, and I thought, oh, this is great. It's an episode that I'm not even in. I'll be able to watch this and not go, oh, God, Wheaton, that was a bad choice. And it turns out that Wesley has a phenomenal story in this episode, and he's been given command over a bunch of adults, and he's been given this responsibility to like be basically a project leader, and he's struggling to be the leader, and he's real confident in the things that need to be done, but he feels like I don't have the right to tell these people who are older and more experienced than I am what to do, and he seeks out advice from Riker on it, and Riker and Wesley have a magnificent scene in 10 Forward where they talk about that. And as I watched that episode, for the first time ever in my life, I was like, yeah, Wesley Crusher is fucking awesome. Wesley Crusher is a badass. Yeah, he was right, you idiots. Scan the planet. Don't not scan it because you're lazy. Listen to this guy. He knows what he's talking about. And I was like, you go, Wesley. I am on your side, man. And I felt like I wasn't watching myself. I was like, oh, my God, this is not an obnoxious kid who feels strange but also good. This is not a kid who's like, oh, I looked at these brain scans and adults, you don't know what you're doing. Ugh. Like, this was a kid who was like, listen, I've done the work, and I know that I'm younger than you, but look, man, I've done the work, and this is what you need to do because that's your job in this thing. And it was written by Melinda Snodgrass, who was one of my favorite writers back in those days. And I was like, why didn't they do this more? This is great. And I understood. Like, I never understood why a kid could look at Wesley going, I feel strange, but also good, or I'm in Starfleet, we don't lie. And like, how could a kid be inspired by that, right? I didn't get it. Yeah. But then watching Pen Pals, I thought, I totally get this. I completely get it. This is exactly if I had a kid, I'd be like, watch this kid and watch how he's confident and he's not a about it. He's confident and he gets it. And these are the things that need to be done. And he's good at it. I get it. I get how inspiring and awesome that is. I had seen Melinda a couple of years ago, probably 5 or 6 years ago at this point. And I had just come off stage talking about how I felt frustrated that the writers didn't talk to us actors more about what was going on with our characters to get a little bit of insight from the people who lived with the characters. And Melinda told me years ago that she was given explicit instructions by the producers that they were not to talk to us, that this was a strict top-down hierarchy, and they were not allowed to converse with us about these sorts of things because then, presumably it would empower the actors, and that's just not the way that that's not the way he ran things. And I often wonder, like, man, like, what could have been if we'd been able to do more things like that? And I was so grateful that, like, I had forgotten about this episode and I was able to watch it kind of like with fresh eyes and really not remember anything about it. And it wasn't until the end that I remembered, oh my gosh, the little girl was Nikki Cox and the weird giant fingers she had kept falling off and disintegrating on the set. That's all I remember of that production. And I think we filmed it in summer. So if we had filmed it during the school year, she and I would have shared the school room together. but we must have shot it during summer and she was a little girl. She was like 8 or 9 years old or whatever, you know. Yeah. I think that probably gets around to addressing a point you had made, but I've since lost it as I celebrated Wesley Crusher's moment of being a badass.
Well, you know, it's funny. I mean, one of the things that we have touched on a lot in doing Mission Log is all of those what could have been moments and kind of the nature of production in the 60s versus production in the 80s, and then what that structure was like, whether it was Gene or, as you mentioned, Rick Berman. Some of those may be misfires. You know, we recently on our show talked about the Dauphin, and we thought how unfortunate that what could have been a very important and interesting character arc for Wesley is played out in 48 minutes or 45 minutes, and then you are done with it. It's like, okay, he meets a girl, he kisses her, he hates her, he likes her, he tries to do the right thing, he tries to be cool again, and then we're done with it and we'll never speak of it again. And we were asking ourselves, well, had a show like that been made now, where, particularly in science fiction, they take these long arcs and they really flesh out an entire season and serialize a show rather than treating it strictly as anthology standalone episodes, that could have been a fantastic role for a kid, you know, a 16-year-old kid, to actually go there over multiple episodes or a couple of seasons. But I wonder, is it just that sort of revolving door, at least the way you guys experience in the first couple of seasons of Next Gen, where writers come and go, and there's now what you're saying, the strict cutoff. Actors can't talk to writers.
In defense of the bosses, that's the way TV worked back then. We didn't have serialized storytelling in prime time, really, unless it was like a primetime soap like Dallas or something like that. We were in first-run syndication, and the way syndicated programs worked back then was you had to have a show that could be watched in isolation of everything else. So things basically went right back, you know, were reset at the end of an episode. And we did have some things that evolved over time, and that was really cool. And as the show went on and got into later seasons, we did open up a little bit more and get to have some things that persisted beyond more than just, you know, sort of one and done. And I think they did a fantastic job towards the end of Deep Space Nine, having this, you know, long and complex storyline. We always wished that things persisted beyond one episode. That was something that we all talked about, and I clearly remember how much we all wanted that. And I mean, the reality was it just wasn't going to happen the way that we wanted it to. I recently read an article or a blog post or I mean, it may even have been like a long comment at Reddit. I can't remember where it was, but I recently read something where someone said, you know, a really, really amazing and fantastic way to put Star Trek on television now would be to treat it like True Detective or American Horror Story, and have a season of, you know, 10 or 12 episodes, and that season explores a single story with a certain number of characters, and then when it's over, it's over. And the following season, you would explore different characters, and so you could have. Just think how amazing it would be for like a season of Star Trek to be about, you know, this season is about the crew of the Enterprise. That's awesome. Okay. Now this season is, about the crew of the Intrepid, or this season is about the engineers on Deep Space 11 or whatever it is. And we get to do Star Trek, and we get to live back in the universe that Gene created and then was like strengthened and deepened and broadened and explored by guys like Ron Moore and Brandon Braga and Melinda Snodgrass and Michael Piller and all of those wonderful, wonderful creative people, and spend a little more time in it in a more intimate way than we did before, I think that it would be like catastrophically successful. And would be just, I mean, even if it was like American Horror Story where you get the same actors doing different things, or like True Detective where it is just completely different things, I think it would be amazing, and I think it would be a phenomenal Netflix series.
Let me ask you a question. I'm sorry.
Well, people are always asking me, would you go back and do Star Trek again? Would you go be Wesley? Would you go be Wesley Crusher again? And I feel like I've done and said everything that can be done and said with Wesley. I might examine a little bit of Wesley, like maybe in prose or something like that, just for my own entertainment. But if I could go back into Star Trek in that configuration, where I could play a completely different character that lives in the Star Trek universe, I would do that in a second.
Well,
see, that's the question that I was going to ask, but I was going to actually pitch you on an idea. Just, you'd be like a mind-blowing, like, guru starship captain, who every now and then would just say, yeah, well, when I went with the Traveler for a while, that was kind of this, and then after that, you're like the guy who went out to find himself, comes back like totally almost transcendental, but also a kick-ass starship captain.
That is I don't think that Wesley Crusher would ever want to be a captain.
Really?
I don't think that he would want to have the responsibility of a crew, and I just don't think that that's something that he would want. I think that he would very, very likely feel a desire to figure out how he is supposed to exist in a world like Wesley's basically a Time Lord, and he would need to figure out how to exist in a world where there are no other Time Lords, or at least not around him, and he has to figure out how to. He has to learn how to be a human.
It is so crazy to think about that character in those terms. You're basically like putting him up next to like Doctor Who and Dr. Manhattan.
Well, I think and I'm sure that there are people who are going to scoff at that because for people there's a non-zero portion of the audience that's sort of like, Wesley is fixed in their mind as I feel strange but also good. But yeah. I think that Ron had that idea for Wesley that he just couldn't. He was too much of a nonconformist to fit into the structure of Starfleet, and I think that Wesley clearly loved the crew. He loved the ship, and he wanted more for himself, and he wanted more for the people around him than that structure could allow. And it's sort of like my son is a genius, and he took and passed the Mensa test when he was 14, and he sometimes operates at this intellectual level that is like really isolating for him because he's the smartest guy in the room and nobody understands him, and nobody can communicate with him in the way that he communicates back. And I imagine that for Wesley Crusher, that was probably going on when he was a super smart kid, right? But also that he was, if we're going to just completely commit ourselves to the reality of the thing, he's also like developing these abilities that are unique to him and a very few number of people and beings who are like him. And it could be sort of metaphysical and weird or whatever, and I think you can accept it or just sort of like retcon it away if you want to, and I think either one of those choices is valid for as far as the audience is concerned.
Let me ask you a question. There's like you say, there's this subset or this group of people who have Wesley set in their mind as kind of the annoying kid. He's also the alter ego for Gene Roddenberry. He's a way for Gene Roddenberry to write himself into the universe that he created. Now, he created the universe, so he's written into it all over the place. But I mean, his middle name is Wesley, and that sounds familiar. How aware were you of that at the time, or were you aware of it at all at the time?
Not very aware, and actually grateful that I wasn't very aware, because if I had been aware, I think that it would have paralyzed me.
Sure.
I had I was so lucky and so privileged to play Ted Kord, the Blue Beetle, on Batman the Brave and the Bold. And Blue Beetle is one of my absolute all-time favorite comic book characters. I'm just like I'm absolutely nuts about this character, and I didn't find out until a long time after I finished recording that I was the first person to give a voice to that character. So in the DC canon, I am the voice of Ted Kord, and had I known that, it would have paralyzed me. Instead of just letting the words do their work and bringing this character to life in a real and truthful way, I would have been overwhelmed with the responsibility of it. And it's the same thing with Star Trek. I would have felt a tremendous, when you start that show at 14 years old, when you're still trying to figure out, who you are. That's so much a part of teenagers can be really annoying, but I think it's very important that adults be patient and kind and gentle with teenagers, because they really are just trying to figure out how to human. Mm-hmm. And had I known at that time that not only am I trying to figure out how to human, but, oh, by the way, you're effectively the avatar of the guy who created this thing that has meant so much to you your entire life. So no pressure, but don't screw it up. I think that I would have been paralyzed by the responsibility of it.
Well, what was your relationship like with Gene? So you weren't aware of this, but here's this guy that clearly you knew who he was because you were a fan of the original Star Trek.
My memories of this are... My memories of my relationship with Gene are unreliable, because they've been, I've recounted some of these meaningful moments in our relationship so many times that they are beginning to feel apocryphal. Mm-hmm. In real broad strokes, we had a really positive relationship. I felt like he cared about me. I felt like he respected me. He was kind to me and patient with me in a way that was very genuine at a time when I could clearly feel from the other producers that I wasn't being talked to. I was being handled. I wasn't being engaged in conversation. I was being dealt with. Gene always made me feel like I deserved to be there, like I was part of his universe. And he made me feel like I was as much a part of Star Trek as anything else. And, I can't recall anyone else from the production side making me feel that way. That's not to say that they never did. It's just that when I look back on this, and it's super important to me to be really clear that my memories on this are not completely clear.
Right.
I mean, we're talking about 30 years ago. But my memories are that he was really wonderful and really lovely to me.
What then? I don't think that it was a particular thing, but if you can kind of talk to us about the decision making to leave the show. how that kind of formulated.
So this story I've written. I really go into this in my book, Just a Geek. I will try to give it a shorter version of it here. I don't recall exactly when this was, but I want to say that it was around the beginning of season 3. I had been cast by Milos Forman to play the role of the Dauphin in his movie Valmont. And the movie would film over hiatus, and I would go work in Paris, and I would play this role, this film role. I was really excited about it because I always wanted to be a film and television actor. And I was probably 15 or 16 around this time. I can't recall specifically. And Gene was not really involved in the day-to-day production at this point. He was near the end of his life, and the way I recall it was in pretty poor health. And around this thing was going to be shot over hiatus, and it would have required me to be off on location. And as we were getting ready to go into production on the movie, Rick Berman called and said, "We're shooting the beginning of the next season out of order. We're not shooting the first episode first. We're shooting the second episode first. And it's a Wesley Crusher episode. You can't be away when we do this episode." Because he had found out that I would need to be on location for roughly 5 days or 7 days of the first week of production of Star Trek. And my agents and the people producing Valmont went back and forth and tried to figure out a way to make it work. And Rick Berman and Star Trek, just for whatever reason, it wasn't going to be possible. And they had me under contract, and we had to not do Valmont. And I was really upset about that because I thought it was a great role. It was a role that I had earned through a lot of really intense, a very long audition process. I knew that Milos Forman was a very big deal and a very respected director, and I knew that this was going to be part of really advancing my film career, which would be terrific. I remember Rick telling me and my mom, "This is a really important Wesley episode, and I've written this scene. I personally wrote this scene for Wesley and Picard. That's really important. And I'm so sorry that you can't do this movie." And I was like, well, okay. A few days before production was to begin on that episode, he wrote me out completely. So I wasn't in the episode at all. And I could have done the movie. And the message that I got from that was super clear. The message from that was, I own you. Don't try to have a career outside of this. And this is the way it's going to be. I found out years later, I mean, in the last 5 or 6 years, I found out from another member of the cast that Rick Berman did that deliberately because he knew that if I did this role and I was successful in the film career, that it was going to make me, I don't know, in his mind, like a bigger deal than he wanted to deal with or something like that. So he sabotaged my film career to make me, I don't know, maybe less expensive or more subservient, or I don't know what it was. And I was so upset by this on so many levels. It wasn't just that, like, this was getting in the way of my career, but it was such a terrible thing to do just to a person. You know, to be so controlling and dishonest and manipulative and just evil. And when that happened, I clearly remember calling my agent directly and saying, get me out of the contract. I don't want to work for this person anymore. I don't want to do this. I don't want to work for someone who treats people like this. And that began the process of writing me out. And, you know, I made that decision like really from a place of like indignation and anger and hurt. And maybe it could have been made in a different way. And, it, you know, from a career standpoint, it wasn't the best decision to make in the short term. In the long term, I don't regret it. You know, it goes back to being part of the tapestry of my life. But that was a decision that I really wrestled with for a really long time. You know, like I had a lot of regrets about it, just because I had, I felt like for all the reasons I talked about before. But at the same time, like, I don't know what else I could have done. You know, I mean, that was a really terrible thing to do to a person.
You see, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, it's weird to think about how different your career could have been as far as if Valmont had happened. But at the same time, I don't want to say that you increased your cred because it took a very long time, but your willingness to walk away from, I mean, I was baffled. I'm not much older than you, but I like maybe a couple of years. I don't know. How old are you? Do you mind if I ask?
I'm 42.
Okay, so I'm like 3 years older than you. I was baffled when you left Star Trek, but I was also the guy who, like, my friends and I would be hanging out on Saturday, and at 5:30, I would leave them and whatever they were doing because I had to go home and watch Next Gen. And then when we were done, I would, go back out and catch up with them. And then even when I moved to Boston and started going to college there, it was still whatever time it was on, that's what I was doing for that time. At the same time, I mean, there's sort of been like you've been able to sort of circle back around to it. The stuff that you do on Big Bang Theory, I mean, is hysterical. But on top of that, I mean, there's almost like there's like a cooler geek cred in a way, in the fact that you're willing to walk away from it. This isn't working. Okay, well, I'll be back later.
Actually, don't I get what you're driving at. Look, consider it from a different way. If I had stayed on the show, I would have gotten very, 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 very rich. I also would have gotten very resentful. I would have grown increasingly unhappy. And I probably would have turned into a true Hollywood story. From that, forced me to learn how to be a human. Struggling as an actor, struggling financially, struggling kind of emotionally in my 20s, forced me to learn how to be a person and to really grow and mature in a way that would not ever had happened if I had stayed a part of Star Trek. Now, and I think that is specifically because of the environment that was created for me. Never with the cast, never with the writers, exclusively with a small subset of the producers. I think that it is possible for people to be children on a show and grow up to be really awesome, fully functioning humans. Johnny Galecki is a fantastic example of that. I sat down with George R.R. Martin at Comic-Con 3 years ago, and he said, I really care about the actors on my show, especially the kids. Can I buy you a drink, and would you please talk to me about what was good and what was bad for you as a child actor, so that I can take care of these kids and help them be, normal and not get screwed up. And I was like, man, why didn't you produce my show? So it's not like I did this because I felt like, I needed to go, earn some kind of merit badge or something like that.
Oh, no.
It was definitely something that happened because I was so unhappy that really the only way to to get out of that and grow out of that was to choose a really different path. And I'm so glad that I did, because I would not have the life that I have right now. And I would not have discovered that it was, I wouldn't have discovered I always liked to write and tell stories, but I never considered myself a writer until that was a thing that I could do. And I probably would not have been in a place to meet my wife, and I wouldn't have my kids. And, my life would be really, really different. And I can't say if it would be better. But I can say that I honestly can't imagine a life better than the one I have right now.
I mean, it's pretty cool that you have been able to reinvent yourself, but within that process, you've done something that I think a lot of actors don't get to, or maybe don't want to do. You've been able to sit there and take the time as a writer to reflect on all of these things that you've done. I mean, the reviews that you've written of Next Gen, the books that you've written, the blog entries that you've done about that. It's kind of rare, and you have that unique perspective of being able to step back for, well, I guess you started doing that after you've been gone for, what, a good 15, 20 years from the show, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a very unique perspective to be able to reflect on that. I wonder, do you think that it sort of gives you an interesting advantage when you are kind of on the convention scene and you're talking to fans? Do you feel like that experience for you is different from other actors?
I think it's probably different because I have been on both sides of the curtain.
Yeah.
Like I have been, I've been going to conventions since I was a kid. I was going to comic book and sci-fi conventions when I was as early as 6th grade. And I've been at conventions where guests are there because they want to celebrate and they will share these moments with with fans. They want to like honor and be excited about this this thing that we all share in common. And then I've been there when people are just like sort of like yeah, give me your money, go on. And it's I don't know, I don't go to conventions because I need money. I go to conventions because I love meeting and talking with people who love these things the same way I do. And I go to conventions because I love that there's this place where we all agree that for 2 or 3 or 4 days we are going to love a thing to the fullest extent it is possible to love it, unabashedly. And we're going to encourage other people to love it the way we do. And I think it's one of the reasons you see a lot of us that are lifelong self-identified geeks are so uncompromising in keeping our culture inclusive, because we've been part of this culture long enough to know that there was a time where it was the only place where we didn't feel weird. And it's, I watch people act like gatekeepers and stuff like that. And I'm like, you're doing it wrong. You're missing the point. Like the point of this is that this is a place where we can come and love this thing together. And I'm really grateful for that. I'm grateful for it's really a privilege that I get to do that. And I also get to choose very carefully who I will work with. I get to choose which promoters I will go and spend time with. And I get to choose, how, if there are people on the guest list that I think are shitty to fans, then I won't go to that convention. I'll go to something different. And I get to make those choices. And I think that promoters remember that these things exist because decades ago, fans of a thing got together and like, we need a place to go where we can celebrate this thing. We need to go and like, we want to like share this and love it. And that while these people are, while these fans are like, they're certainly they're a demographic and certainly they're a market and an audience. They're also in many ways, they're part of a family of people that love a thing. And, family will put up with a lot of shit, but there comes a point where if you're shitty enough to family, they're like, you know what? I'm out. And it's a real important thing for all of us to remember.
A few weeks ago when we were doing our discussion about the Dauphin, it was revealed on Mission Log. It's not a secret to anybody that I've talked to, but we finally talked about it on Mission Log, that I had auditioned for Wesley for that role. And we talked about how, jokingly, how I might have played things differently. But we didn't tell the whole story. And the whole story is that from 1987, at least until 1990, in my household, living at home, we would refer only to Wil Wheaton as that pinhead Wil Wheaton or that pinhead Wesley Crusher, because he was the guy who got the role. And so years go by, and you mature and you shake that off. And I emailed that to Will, oh gosh, this is probably 10 years ago or more. And you were very gracious about writing back, haha. And I'm sure Wesley would have something to say about this, but I won't let him because he is dead. But the epilogue to that is that every time you and I have run into each other recently, I have to say that you are one of the most open and accessible and kind and friendly people that I've gotten to know. And from the pinhead to the guy that I will talk to about where to get good barbecue and other really important issues, that's really cool. That's really kind of awesome. But yeah, the pinhead no more. I will give you that for sure. But no, it's so funny to hear you talk about the things that would have been different in your life. And then I think any one of us could be reflective about that and go, yeah, it's like you're talking about with Tapestry. You sit there and think, well, how would things have been different? And the journey that you went through, and probably the very good fortune of leaving the show when you did, may have prevented you from being on True Hollywood Stories, and may have prevented you from having a very different and potentially very negative adult life.
Yeah, well, and also F. Scott Fitzgerald said there's no second acts in American life, and my my attitude about that was, well, challenge accepted.
Yeah.
I don't need to, and I'm very, 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 very lucky that I live in the world now at this point, and that 10 years ago I was at that point, then in the late 70s or whatever, because it really is possible, starting around a decade ago when I started my blog and now, for creative people to be creative and express themselves creatively to an audience without having to go through a series of gatekeepers and working through a legacy system that kind of perpetuates itself at the expense of the individual. And had I not had the incredible good fortune of doing these things when I did, maybe even this second half would have been really different. Mm-hmm. And it's I will absolutely take credit for very hard work. And before Conan O'Brien said it, I was sort of doing my best to live the adage that you can really do a lot when you're kind and you work hard. And I'm very, very lucky that I've had people who believed in me when I didn't believe in me. And I'm really lucky that I'm just really lucky that things turned out the way that they did. There've been lots of times where they could have gone a different way. And one of the things that I don't know if this is clear or not, but I freaking love Star Trek. I still love Star Trek. I love everything about Star Trek. And I love that I am part of it. And I love that it is part of me. And my really kind of crummy experience with one or two people who are unfortunately in a position to really affect what my overall experience with Star Trek be, notwithstanding. Like, Star Trek is really awesome. And I'm really lucky and grateful and proud to be part of something that is so important to so many people who are divided by space and time and language and culture.
Yeah, well, try doing a podcast about it every week.
Oh, do you mean the internet doesn't tell you about how you're wrong about everything? Come on, man. Are you new?
It's funny. I bet a lot of the mail and comments that we get is maybe similar to a lot of the mail and comments that you get. Yeah. I
tell you, we started our show Titan's Grave, The Ashes of Volcana for Geek and Sundry, which is my role-playing show, role-playing game show. And I'm really, really, really it is, this is going to be, this has the opportunity to like really fundamentally change the way people look at role-playing games and the way people look at, storytelling in role-playing games and things like that. And it was announced, and I went to it's like I'd never been on the internet before. Just like a jackass, I went to EN World to look and see, this community that I really like, oh, what do they think about it? And knowing absolutely nothing about the story I wrote, knowing nothing about the characters, knowing very little about the actors, knowing basically the name of the game, the system we were using, and the description that it is a combination of high science fiction and high fantasy, the number of people who were like, well, this is going to be garbage, was astonishing to me. And then the number of people who also were like, were basically calling me a fake geek girl was astounding to me. I couldn't believe it. I was like, this is really weird. And I've gotten to a point now where, I've run out of to give about people being jerks about stuff on the internet. But there's a point where I'm like, really? Maybe if you watch 2 or 3 episodes and you're like, this isn't for me, these are the things I don't like, fine. Good. Have that. But to just immediately just be like, oh, God, yeah. Before anything has shown up, it reminded me of the people who were like, well, I'm never watching Next Generation because it doesn't have Captain Kirk on it.
Right? Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Or these people who are like, a friend of mine was, all of these angry, entitled white guys were freaking out that Ghostbusters was being remade. Because Ghostbusters was being remade with a female cast, or not even remade, that there was going to be a Ghostbusters made with a female cast, their life was ruined.
Right.
And a friend of mine said, Ghostbusters didn't ruin your childhood. Your father ruined your childhood. Figure it out, guys.
I will say, though, I've been doing podcasting for, I think, 10 years this summer. And it's like a daily show. And the amazing thing is, you think you've run out of to give about people on the internet, But you can always find a reserve.
It's always a bummer when I go. It's a bummer when I go to the drawer that I used to keep my in, and I'm like, oh, there's a I forgot about.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
But I will say this, and this is extremely important. This is really important perspective. Really, 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 really important. The number of people who are wagons about things is so phenomenally outweighed by the number of people who are awesome.
Yeah.
That if you had to quantify it, the number of people who are wagons is probably down to about between like less than 0.5% and like 0.75% when you take the total, take the audience and you take the total. And my friend John Rogers points out that in general, people don't go, I loved that. I got to run onto the internet and tell people how great it is. And someone's like, this displeases me. I now have to put on my caps and let the world know why. And if you presume a ratio of 3 to 1 of people who actually like a thing versus how many people actually talk about a thing, so if your like bleh comments are like 1 to 1 or 2 to 1, you're still ahead.
Yeah.
Because there's people who aren't talking about things. And I think this is a thing that people have just come to accept and understand. And we just see that, every year more children or people who have the emotional maturity of children get access to the internet and feel like they can, finally feel empowered to like do a thing without being held to account for it. It's just a cycle that's going to endlessly repeat itself. And it's kind of incumbent on we in the creative side of things. It is incumbent upon us to just sort of go, well, just because you're mad about a thing doesn't mean that I have to be as mad about it as you are.
Rod, you've been very quiet. Before we let Will go, is there anything that you would like to chime in with?
No, absolutely not, guys. This has been phenomenal. And Will, Ken said it the best, and John said it as well. You are so honest. You're so personable. I almost feel like we should ask you harder questions, but I don't know any harder ones to ask you. We've had an interesting, we've had an interesting sort of relationship over the years. The first time I met you, and you and I have told the story many times, but of course was the first season of Next Gen in '87. And you always tell it much better than I do. But I remember us both being excited that there was another kid there. And of course, as you say so well, we never saw each other again. And
it's true. We were both so excited to be 14 years old on the set, and then I was being an actor, and you were being a production assistant. And then the only time I ever really got to see you was when I would come to your parents' house for parties. And we would be like, oh, thank God, let's get away from these lame adults.
Yeah. And hearing these stories, hearing you share what you went through in such a personal way, I know how privileged I am, and now I even know more so how privileged I am, because when I was on set and when I was doing what I was doing, none of that was required of me. I mean, I was told to behave, but I never listened, and I just off as much as I wanted to, and would terrorize people on my bike running through the lot, and would just have a grand old time. And it's just such a contrast to what you went through. And you don't need anyone's apology. I just feel bad that you went through that.
I will tell you, I don't think I've ever really talked about this, but one time your dad came down to the stage and he had his golf cart and he left the keys in it. So I got in the golf cart and basically took it on a reckless joyride all over the backlot at Paramount, speeding around the backlot, blowing through stop signs, honking the horn at everybody I possibly could, and then finally, like, coming back around the corner of Stage 9 and speeding down that street back to where the entrance of Stage 8 and 9 was, and going over this thing that was sort of like a speed bump, but also like covered up cables so that the cables, could go across the street and be driven over safely. And this speed bump thing was made of interlocking pieces of rubber, and I hit it so hard that I kind of jumped it, and then I like kind of did like a Dukes of Hazzard power slide to stop the car.
Nice.
And it tore it all apart, and it pulled the things out. And I got in so much trouble for that. I got yelled at so hard by people that didn't even work on the show. And I was expressly forbidden from ever driving your dad's golf cart after that. But I will point out that your dad never yelled at me about it.
Yeah.
Right? Your dad was like, I shouldn't have left the keys in it. And all these other people were like, wrecking for some kids, blah, 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 blah. And I was like, yeah, that's right. What are you going to do about it? It was like the one and only time that I was always really well behaved. And it was like the one and only time that I was just like, I am now possessed of a particular mind to do a particularly reckless thing.
That is awesome. That is so awesome to hear. I'm glad to hear that. We'll probably cut this part out, but there was one other story you told that made me, my parents tried to get me into acting. I did a few commercials when I was really young. And on one of them, I think it was a granola commercial, I talked back to the director, and that was my last commercial. So
I remember doing a commercial once where the director was like, do the it was for brownies, and he was like, take a bite of the brownie and then sing the brownie song. And I was like, okay. And I take a bite of the brownie and I swallow it and I sing the brownie song, and he goes from talking to screaming.
Wow.
I mean, like terrifying me, right? I was so afraid, screaming at me about how stupid I was and how I couldn't take direction and how I couldn't do anything. And it was because what I was supposed to do was take a bite of the brownie and then, sing the brownie song with the brownie somewhere tucked in my mouth. But he didn't communicate that to me. I'm like 7 years old, and I'm doing what people do, which is swallow their food. And it was right around that time that I was like, I don't want to do commercials anymore. I guess I want to go do movies. Because I had been sort of like told by my mom that this is what I was going to do,
right?
I'm grateful that in the entire production of Star Trek, there were only 2 directors who were crappy to me because I was a kid. And I remember Gates always standing up for me. They would, we had this one director who would always just refer to me as the boy. And I remember Gates started it, and then all the other actors sort of like piled on, and he would say blah blah the boy, and one of the other actors would say his name is Will.
Nice.
And then there was a director who really liked to grab me by the elbow and move me around. And I remember at one point I kind of testily yanked my arm away from him, and I said, "If you tell me where you'd like me to go, I can stand on my mark."
Nice.
And I didn't get in trouble for those things. I'm glad I didn't.
You shouldn't have. Yeah, good. Good. Well, thank you so much. Listening to everything you had to say was really spectacular.
From the Roddenberry archive, let's take a closer look at a discovered document.
All right, welcome back to another dazzling rendition of Discovered Documents, joined again by...
I'm blinded.
Right, joined again by Dr. Trek himself, Larry Nemeczek, and this is the new-ish segment on Mission Log, where we will talk about all those fantastic behind-the-scenes memos and documents that just keep showing up at the Roddenberry office and archive.
Millions of trees died for your fandom.
Right. Hey, but now they'll be preserved in digital form forever for everybody to see.
Yay.
This is dated from the 27th of October, and that would have been 1989, so it's early second season.
1988.
Oh, that's right, 88?
Yes,
Yeah. Second season is 88 into 89. Thank you for that.
Yep.
And this is a letter written, as you pointed out to me, on beautiful Paramount Pictures stationery from Patrick Stewart to Gene Roddenberry. A bit more formal than a normal memo, but also very friendly and personal.
Right.
So apparently the setup is this. They had lunch, and Patrick Stewart took the opportunity to sort of unload on Gene.
Right. Well, I mean, seriously, I think the beginnings and ends of seasons, especially the beginnings of seasons, a little bit like the start of a new school year, or the start of a TV season. And when you have your lead and your executive producer, or the major actors, Gene, I know, sat down and had. I know Marina has talked about their starting the second season lunch. And some of the points she was trying to make. So I think that was probably Gene reaching out to the cast before things get crazed, and people are on deadline and people are pulling their hair out or they're exhausted while people are still fresh. And they sit down and go, okay, we've had a breath and we've also had our hiatus break. So now we're about to start the new school year.
Right.
and let's talk about stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
So what they talk about then is Patrick Stewart's sort of, maybe not displeasure, but his concern. Say that there are story elements happening, there are character elements maybe not happening that he would like to see given more attention by the writers of Star Trek. And he actually goes kind of point by point. He says, okay, so far what we've seen in the beginning of season 2 is...
And I should say, I was being a little misleading talking about before school starts. This was October. They had shot about 5 or 6 episodes and probably had 3 or 4 more of the scripts were circulating.
Right, yeah. So he says, okay, we've had me battle an unstable virus. We've had Nagilum, we've had Moriarty, we've had Debon and Kushel, and we've had, that's of course from the outrageous Okona, or Okana, depending on which side of the camp you're from, and then Dr. Ira Graves / Data. And what he's getting at, and I think it's a really good point, is he says that, these are all situations. And it's a situation where maybe you've got then Picard to come in and say the right thing and be the negotiator, and then you solve the problem and you move on. But there's nothing really deep or personal or interesting about it. Is that the impression that you got from this memo?
Right. Well, he says it very, I say bluntly, but elegantly. He says the Enterprise is threatened and Picard deals with it.
Yeah, right.
You know?
Right. And then he even goes in to say, like, well, the captain isn't doing anything physical. He shows up and he says something smart, and then he goes away. And he even says, we've established that Picard is a fencer. We got that at the opening of an episode where he's in there fencing. But then there's really nothing else physical for him to do. I love that he even asked, doesn't the Enterprise have a shooting range? Couldn't I just go? I just go spend some time practicing shooting my phaser? Which,
well, that's a point, because this memo, as we read through it, some of those roots of things that we did start to see, because we did see the phaser range eventually by the end of the second season. I love what he says here about. From the actor's viewpoint, which we don't think about a lot as fans, but he's talking about just a trained Shakespearean actor who gets off stage. He's done action movies. He did Dune. He's done lots of things. He's not being a prude here, but he's just saying, as an actor, the challenge is of a narrow spectrum and the stimulation moderate.
Right.
In other words, as I said sadly on Friday, the work and the prospect of work is somewhat less interesting than our first season.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and I really like that he calls out some specifics, because obviously it shows that he's paying attention to what is going on with the other characters, and particularly their relation to Picard. So he says, look, I don't want to... There's a great line. He said, please let us not use up Whoopi's quota without examining that, meaning examining his background and their personal relationship. He even says, I have yet to play a scene with Will that was not a delight. And he says,
yes.
I've ever told you what a fan I am of that young man. That is really great. And if Wil Wheaton does not know that, we'll have to share that with him.
and he says, I hope that I'm not going to entirely lose him to Geordi, Riker, and Guinan.
Right.
Based on the early shows. Yeah. Right. He calls out, he says, look, Picard has a sense of humor. We did say it's called the Blue Parrot and you're buying. How comforting. Right. He's remembering some lines of earlier shows, which is, one thing. If you're going to be the king on the throne in the middle of the bridge, you can't have it be deadly dull.
Yeah.
But yeah, he's talked about a shooting range. He talks about, this is interesting too. He said, well, we saw him fencing. I hope there's at least some other, he says, aristocratic versions of the modern pentathlon: fencing, shooting, riding, bobsled.
Right.
But it wasn't long after this that we saw him on the horse, questionizing with at the beginning. I think it was pen pals. So in the holodeck.
Yeah.
So and then I don't think we got back to that much except for him having the saddle.
Yeah.
in the one show with the terrorists, but then he and Kirk on horseback together made sense. So you could in generations. But yeah, so it's like they did get to those. Yeah. Yeah, or probably Robert sled in his world.
Right. Nice. But then we close it out with something I think very interesting. Then he talks about personal relationships. Mm-hmm. And he mentions Beverly. And I love this. He says that he knows that there is a school of thought that a Picard-Crusher relationship never existed. But then he says, look, I played it, at least in the first season, I played it as if there was. And
well, do his wording. I know there's a school of thought that a Picard-Crusher relationship never existed, but I am a little puzzled by this, as I spent hours in front of the camera last season assuming and acting that it did.
Right. And then followed up by, certainly my mailbag confirms this.
Yes.
So the fact, the idea that they had kicked around and talked about, and he even played it as if there had been a relationship, an intimate romantic relationship with Beverly Crusher.
That was certainly what you got from Naked Now. But how many times? I think it's 3 times. They started to run with a joke line of Beverly saying, Jean-Luc, there's something I've always wanted to tell you. And then she would get cut off.
Right.
That was like that was one of those premature joke lines that got kind of like the French joke, like the Chekhov joke. Mm-hmm. It didn't last very long, but it was definitely there. So to say that was never an intention in that flux of writers, the merry-go-round of writers, so he's calling out for it here.
Now, personally, I still kind of wonder about that, only because I feel like we're back at a Kirk and Rand kind of thing, where if you have this presence on board the ship that then becomes the captain's personal concern, do you then throw off the stories? And certainly for a show written in the 60s and a show written in the mid-80s, a little bit different than the way that character arcs, I think, are presented now. I think you really could have written yourself into a corner, and the only way to solve that is to get rid of that character, as they did with Rand. And there was a little help here that Crusher was just gone by the end of the first season. Picard is saying, can we please write in some kind of relationship, something to give a little personal life to Picard? And you said that means that what he's asking for is sex and shooting.
Well, that's the phrase by the third season when Captain's Holiday was a specific request. He as the show had gone on, and everyone, Next Generation began with one of the cornerstones of, okay, we love original series, but here's some of the things we're going to fix, right? The transporter will not break down every other week as a story springboard. It'll just be the holodeck now, but it will be the transporter.
Right.
But one of the things was people over the years, I think David Gerald, most effectively in his making it, or in his World of Star Trek book, said in the real world, a captain of a starship, just like the captain of a Navy vessel, would not lead the landing parties whenever they would go ashore. Someone underneath him would do that. There's far too much investment in him to risk him, especially in a danger zone.
Yeah.
And of course, but that's, Kirk and Shatner and the man of action jumping off. So they really started the whole thing about Riker being the leader of the away teams and Picard sitting back. And after a year, it was starting to sink in here that, that's deadly dull.
Right.
for Picard. So let's find a way to do that. And that led into, by the third season, that meme of, that was their nickname for it, sex and shooting. And so that led to Captain's Holiday, and then you started seeing him do that. In fact, they started mocking the, Picard would look at Riker and say, now tut-tut, number one, don't, mother hen me or whatever,
Right. Yeah.
So it did evolve out of that. But this memo is great because it's laying the groundwork of that rebellion, or that movement toward, okay, we've had a year down, now how are we going to evolve the guy? evolve the guy.
And I think what is so cool is that there's always the question about how much of a character is the writer, how much of the character is the director, how much of the character is the actor, and this really draws a straight line from the actor to the producer and then to the writers who were able to implement what was pulled from this and made into very good character choices for Picard. And it shows the actor taking a really active and thoughtful interest in what the character becomes. So I want everybody to check out this memo. I think it's fantastic. And Larry, thank you so much for joining us for this segment.
It's been fun, John, and I can't wait to dive into another one.
Well, we will do it again for sure. And remember, you can find Dr. Trek at his website, LarryNemechek.com, and the TreklandBlog.com. And you can also follow him on Twitter at Larry Nemechek. And be sure to like Larry Nemechek's Trekland on Facebook. You can also support his documentary there, The Con of Wrath.com, and on Facebook. And remember, he has archives for collectors at the Trekland Trunk Facebook page.